Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the January 10th Grants Pass City Council Workshop. I believe we have Councilor Fazier on the phone. Is Vanessa also on the phone now? Councilor Auger on the phone. Councilor De La Grange is running late today. And Rob says he's going to need to leave early, so we'll all be here for parts of it. Sounds like Urban Campground is going to be first on our agenda today to accommodate Kelly. Go ahead, Aaron.
I'll take my mask off here. Good morning, Mayor and Council. So the first topic for your discussion is a general consideration of establishing an urban campground on 6th and A Street as proposed by Council to have this discussion today. This supports your goal of facilitating sustainable, manageable growth. You do have Objective 2, which is encourage an environment which provides for the growth of affordable housing, specifically Action 2, which is facilitate development of homeless shelter and our urban campground. So the specific piece of property that was mentioned to be discussed today is 6th and A Street. This is a piece of property that is owned by the City of Grants Pass. It is a half acre if you combine the two parcels that are there on the property. It was a former gas station that the city now has acquired this property, and it's shown here as just a blank gravel lot. It is, just as a note, it is within 1,000 feet of a school, and it does look like it has water and sewer at the curb, but it's at the curb, so there would, if that was to be just some additional information for you. So in talking about an urban campground, there are a number of things that would need to be established and put into place. These are just a couple of bullet points that might help facilitate future discussion for council if you're going to take more of an active role in that. One is operations. Who would be operating that urban campground? Would we provide water and sewer? What about electricity? Shelter units, what would they look like? Like the ones that we have here in the picture, which we are storing some right now for Rogue Retreat at our facility. What kind of bathrooms would be provided? Shower and hygiene, what level of service would be provided there? And then revenue for operating the facility, where would that come from? And those are just some general, larger topic items that may need to be discussed in the future, depending on where you go with this. So in preparation of the presentation today, I did reach out to Kelly Wessels of UCAN and then also Chad and Matt of Rogue Retreat and had a conversation with them Friday about this site and about their ability to service it. And on the screen for you are comments associated with my discussion with them. They do have some concerns about that site being chosen or discussed as an urban campground. First, was that site really provides an exploitation of individuals at the location because of its sight and sound to major thoroughfares. They believe it's too centralized because of that. Also, that location there, a lot of traffic, a lot of visibility. It's good to be seen but not seen, as Chad McComas mentioned to me on the phone. So it's a good place. An urban campground is good to be seen but maybe not seen is in such a centralized location. They mentioned that it's not necessarily safe for those served, and some of the examples were discussed were some experiences that Eugene had when they put up a urban campground by University of Oregon, where there was high traffic area and they were having traffic issues with the individuals being served there and accidents that were occurring with vehicles. So this was a concern of this location also. In speaking with Rogue Retreat, they mentioned that they at this time do not have staffing available and to service an urban campground. And the discussion continued with Kelly and Rogue Retreat also, that really right now those two agencies that would be key to operating and financing an urban campground in our community are currently right now focusing on a shelter. And they want to establish this shelter, and that's something that Kelly's been working really hard at, and she's made some great progress in making that happen, along with partnering with Rogue Retreat for a warming shelter for this community. So UCAN has been taking the lead on that, and currently their resources for having something like that put into place is focused on this shelter that Kelly is taking the lead on. The comments that I received from both of those parties also mentioned that this is not the right location and that the city should continue to make progress, but focus on finding the right spot and don't rush it. Find the right spot to be successful for the community. So those were the caveats that were mentioned, and Kelly is also on the line. She can provide any additional information associated with this topic and what was discussed. Rogue Retreat was unable to be here today, but and Kelly can only be here for a small amount of time, first part of this meeting, and so that's why she's online today with us. So your call to action is at your discretion. Alternatives is to direct staff to implement an urban campground on 6th and A Street. Continue discussion and discovery of appropriate locations for an urban campground. Provide direction based on council's discussion through the workshop, or take no action currently. And with that, Mayor, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Aaron. Kelly, while you're there, do you have anything to add right now?
Thank you, Mayor, and council individuals. I think it was summarized quite well. We do take it very seriously to ensure that whatever projects we work on, Rogue Retreat and UCAN, in order to address these concerns for the city and for its citizens, that we are able to do the highest quality of work, because we are also impacting the most vulnerable of our community. So I think it was summarized well, and our efforts are really being focused right now on trying to get the Out of the Cold project together and on the ground. We have made significant progress in the last week, and I just would like the opportunity to do a project really well rather than dividing efforts and then falling short.
Okay, are you able to tell us anything more about your other project at this time?
I can tell you that we are looking at a 25 to 30 bed emergency shelter, warming shelter, that would operate through March 31st, that Rogue Retreat would be the operator. They have submitted a proposal to me that we had a case conference over at the end of last week to go over the details, and we are in the final stages of solidifying that agreement. We have a lease that has been executed for a building that is actually held by another nonprofit, but is its use has been residential treatment. So we feel very comfortable with the fact that it is an appropriate, safe environment, and that we are hoping to get things moving fairly quickly as far as standing it up. This is, Rogue Retreat is wanting to do a 24/7 model, which will address some of the concerns for people during the daytime. So some of the concerns that were articulated in a previous model, where a warming center releases to the street and there's really not any place for anyone to go. This model would support day center support and continued case management. And I think if you recall, when you speak, at least to us as operators, Rogue Retreat and myself, we both believe that that's the key to making people feel supported and able to make decisions that move them forward and out of street homelessness.
Thank you. Council, do you have any questions? Rob?
Thanks, Kelly. Can you repeat again, what did you say is the key to moving them forward and out of homelessness? You just at the end of what you just said.
It really has to do with the approach to continued and sustained case management interaction.
Thank you.
Does anybody else have any questions? Check my phone for people on the phone. All right. Thanks, Aaron. I don't think we need to really belabor this issue. I think the 6th and A Street idea was born out of frustration. You know, I know the council's been talking for a year at least now about doing something, and we've been struggling to find a good location. And this is property that we own, but I think people are not necessarily real interested in pursuing this particular location, but I think this is a sign that the council is frustrated and wants to do something, and so we need to work on focusing our efforts to take action. And I think that UCAN and Rogue Retreat have put together a plan that will help alleviate some of our concerns while we're still pursuing this idea of the campground. Go ahead, Joel.
One of the public comments too, you know, a democracy that isn't necessarily an efficient mechanism, but eventually they come at some very good solutions. The county, of course, is suffering a pretty severe law enforcement funding episode, I guess, for lack of a better word. And I was wondering if informally or perhaps even formally, but it's probably not ripe for formal at this stage, to approach the county in terms of urban campground on county land that's close to the city that would also help them and fund law enforcement. And I know that we had one citizen comment earlier talk about out by the bus depot behind the services there at Fred Meyer and some county land that's out there, and I haven't explored it. I got a phone call in to some folks, but it might be a win-win situation for everybody. We will come up with a good solution, I know.
Yeah, we do need to address how we're going to move forward on the urban campground. Slightly off topic here because it didn't involve 6th and A, but I spoke with some members of our All Care Foundation partners, and they have some serious concerns about the way that the grant idea is moving forward, and so we need to reassess, I think, whether or not the city wants to pursue purchasing land ourselves, that way we maintain control and ownership, or whether we want to actually give them a grant. But we have been trying to do something a little bit too complicated, and so we need to have a further discussion about that. I'm going to be putting it on the agenda very soon. All right, anything further on this topic? Rob?
Yeah, I appreciate you bringing up the county as potential partner, Joel. It'd be nice if they actually took solving this problem or addressing this problem seriously. The last I heard from the county, I guess it was Commissioner DeYoung, suggested that they donate a toxic waste site or something like that to put the homeless campground on. So I don't think that at that time they were in any way, shape, or form looking at this reasonably or seriously. If maybe they need some help with funding with something else, maybe they would be actually constructive this time around when we discuss it. But if they're not going to be constructive, then we need to move forward as a city and get this done.
Sure.
Yeah, that's true. I have asked for the county's help, and I was told the landfill as a suggested location, and I also specifically asked about the use of the fairgrounds and was told no. So just so you know, we have talked to the county on a couple of different occasions about this earlier in the year. I don't know that the idea near the jail has been specifically addressed, but I haven't gotten the sense that they are real interested in helping us solve this problem.
I understand.
All right, let's move on. Emergency declaration process. We're not declaring an emergency today, quite yet. Just a standard Monday so far.
I will continue.
Just getting it ready for you.
Thank you.
There you go.
Good morning. How's my sound?
Hi, Emily, good.
Okay. So along the lines of, this is just a standard Monday so far, this discussion or briefing has been on the books for a little while. And so there's a mix of kind of standard information that I wanted to share with you today. I adapted it a little bit to reflect some of the extreme weather conversations that have been happening and how declarations may or may not play a role. Some of this information may be really familiar to you, so we don't need to get too into depth. I'm just going to skim through some of the highlights. You have them there in your packet to read, and then we can have some question and answer time if you want. So, just in basic, quickly, this is the general rollout of how most folks envision and experience an emergency or disaster declaration. Always, even if it's just for a very brief period of time before it's handed over to a larger response team, always the response is local in nature, local government, local community, always provide the initial response to an emergency or disaster, and then always receive it back in the end, no matter how high up the chain of response it goes, it always comes back to the locals. So the purpose of a declaration is about exceeding resources or needing to activate authorities. So if you think disaster, which is what most people tend to think of with these types of tools, if the immediate local resources are exceeded, you request neighboring government and communities to support you via your existing mutual aid, MOUs, and your regional emergency operation plan partners. If then that regional mutual aid resource or assistance is exceeded, then declare a state of emergency requesting higher levels of assistance. Requests always flow from the local upward, as I said, city to county to state to federal to international, depending on the scale. And just a few highlights here, referring you, oh, can I move this? I can move this, right? Yeah, I won't bother. So just a reminder and referral that I recently presented to you and the other major city jurisdiction and the county, the emergency operations plan. City of Grants Pass has an annex, as well as in the base plan of the EOP, there are sections just about declarations and that process. So if you haven't had a chance to familiarize yourself with those sections yet, please go ahead and do that. The purpose of a declaration is really, you can think of it in two forms. The one form is to use it as a request to activate or invoke something. And usually you're activating or invoking a unique or specific power, ability, or authority that you don't use normal day to day. I think there's been some confusion. The word declaration, I think, makes people feel like you're declaring a statement. So there have been a number of uses of an emergency declaration around the state of Oregon recently as a way to declare unhappiness or disagreement about something, because a proclamation or a resolution at a local jurisdiction doesn't feel strong enough. You feel like you want the strength of a declaration to say, not only am I having a bad day, I disagree with something. That's not really the best use of this tool. I mean, you can use a screwdriver as a hammer, but it's one of those things. There's always probably a best way to use a certain tool. So maybe instead of emergency declaration, think of it as an emergency request. So if you look at just requesting to activate or invoke an ability or an authority, often that's an internal thing. It's an internal resolution, typically tied to your own local ordinance, charter, or city regulation. And so some examples of that, when you do an emergency declaration, you're requesting or announcing that you are activating or invoking the ability to suspend contracts, redistribute funds, delegate emergency-specific powers, change normal city operations. Those are some typical examples, and you've been through that before, recently with COVID, things like that. You can also use it as a request for assistance, or usually, again, around specific resources, funding sources, and designations. So you can use an emergency declaration in conjunction with a conflagration designation. That's typically done at the county level, but if you've been here for a little while, you've gotten familiar with wildfire conflagrations through the Oregon State Fire Marshal process. You can request specific equipment or personnel, approval for future reimbursement, immediate emergency funds, supplies, or unique or specific technical expertise that you cannot find locally or regionally. So those are some examples of how to use it, and then I just put in there as a reminder, which is in the EOP as well, typical requests for assistance within an emergency declaration should include those specific pieces. Any questions about that so far? Nope. Okay. So it's all about scale. So you can have an internal need for an emergency declaration at the local level, which only affects and involves the city. You can have one that only affects and involves the county, or both, all the way on up. So examples of a local emergency declaration could be kind of a small-scale landslide, extreme weather event, drinking water contamination that's within the jurisdiction only, a localized chemical spill, etc. So, and again, an emergency declaration could start out local and grow right from there, or vice versa. So there's always, in responses and incidents, there's a scaling up and a scaling down that will always occur over a period of time, and the impact will make a difference on what you choose to do. So local emergency declarations, often again guided by your emergency operations plan, your city regulations, county charters, and the like. And then state and federal major disasters or emergency declarations are more, again, what people tend to think of, hurricane level kinds of stuff. So on this next page, I'm not going to read all the way through it, but if you skim through it, it just kind of walks you through an example of something we just recently experienced, how emergency declarations for extreme weather occur at the state level, local level, jurisdictional level, and an example of how that might work with this city. So if you look at like a major snow and ice event that brings down a major amount of infrastructure within the city jurisdiction for whatever reason, you start off with your own local deployment of your own local resources. You find that it exceeds your local capacity. You request mutual aid responses. You find that it exceeds your mutual aid and immediate regional capacity. You declare your state of emergency. You coordinate requests for additional equipment, funds, and personnel. The county can assist. Usually that's me as the county emergency manager working with whoever is designated to be the city EM, or playing both those roles, depends on what's happening. The push of the request to the state, if that's the need, can be done. We submit the city declaration directly to OEM, the Office of Emergency Management, or the county can create a complementary emergency declaration saying, because the city is within our jurisdiction and we cannot meet the needs that they're requesting, we are pushing it up through the state. We're all having a bad day together today, is essentially what that does. So I know there's been obviously a lot of conversation about extreme weather, in this case cold weather, and sheltering, and whether or not emergency declarations play a role. So I wanted to talk about that a little bit in the hopes that that would be helpful to you. So it's good to think about what's the intent of the declaration or the action that you want to take. What's the need for the resources? So I just have two examples out here. One is from Florida. This is Florida's, a county in Florida's cold weather shelter kind of activation reminder to the public. It says, so following cold weather shelters will be opened if ambient temperature falls below 45 degrees. So for them, right, that's significant. So again, it comes back to your local need, your local intent. Everybody's jurisdictional needs are going to drive what your trigger points and decision points are. The other opposite direction comes from Wisconsin, where I grew up. There were no declarations or activities or actions or warnings at all unless it dropped below zero, typically below zero with a wind chill factor. Might have changed since I grew up, but it was not unusual to be out waiting for the bus at 10 degrees below zero. So you can see there's a pretty wide range there between how those two jurisdictions identified intent and need and purpose. So just to kind of close it up, in terms of thinking about a declaration, when you're talking about extreme weather response and or sheltering as a piece of that, you might not need a declaration, but you will probably at some point want a guide. And this is something we've all talked about before. So it's something that maybe you want to discuss with your administration, and I can be directed to assist however you want. So of course there are city municipal codes and regulations. There's probably some more work to be done about defining temporary and permanent shelters and disaster versus non-disaster shelters. And the purpose of city shelters, whether it's to supplement existing and ongoing community shelters or additional purposes. We all know that Grants Pass Fire has a temporary shelter policy, which must be referenced. Stakeholders, community think tanks can help us all identify stable community locations, their purpose, their staffing, their volunteer, and other resources. We've talked briefly in the past about whether or not to go ahead and develop an extreme cold decisions guide. You also have existing a draft proposed extreme heat guide from this previous summer, if you remember that. It was finalized and approved with county public health at the county level. You had some slightly different versions that you wanted to look at that could be finalized, especially prior to summer. Or you could put the two together. The extreme cold and extreme heat guides can include both hazards and then make a trigger points decision guide for future city action. You'll probably at the same time or once you've identified what that policy and proposal is going to look like, review the need for city weather event regulation language to match your need or desire to tie it to declarations. So what I mean by that is, are you going to require a local declaration to request specific authorities or actions that you need in order to activate your community shelters or your community activities? So that goes back to that first kind of more internal resolution use of an emergency declaration. You're almost speaking to yourself and your general public and any of your partners saying, we're making a declaration because herein we have said within our regulation language or ordinance language that we must have a declaration in place in order to trigger and authorize the use of these resources that we need for this extreme type of weather event. Or you can follow your decision points and guides without a tie to a declaration and just evaluate events for emergency impacts individually. And what I mean by that is there are scenarios like the ones that you just experienced in this last event where really it looked like we came very close to saying this is an emergency at the county and city level. There were concerns about major infrastructure damage. As that storm situation and those series of storms passed through, we could see that things were stabilizing out at the Red Cross level, at the state level. You know, things started to ramp back down. You decided to have a shelter response anyways, and you didn't need a declaration because you didn't need to activate or invoke any special authorities or powers or request any out of the ordinary resources that you didn't have on hand. So if you had felt the need to do that, you could have done a declaration essentially saying like, this is our purpose, this is our need, these are the things we're missing, and the declaration helps you either request assistance to get those things or just to authorize their use in a way that you don't typically use them day to day. So some things to think about there. Happy to continue to have conversations with you about that. I'll be continuing to have similar conversations at the county and other city jurisdiction level. But I guess what it comes down to, again, going back to, it's all about the scale and level of impact. You can authorize an action or a response without necessitating a declaration, or you can require a declaration within your local language to occur first in order to trigger certain responses or authorities. Does that make sense? Maybe. And I can help provide some examples of that too, if you want to dig into that deeper. But that's just kind of the overall concepts, and that's all I had today.
I have a question, I guess.
Yeah.
Just kind of regarding this difference between a declaration and evaluating. So, I mean, I would say that what we did last week or 2 weeks ago now with the emergency shelter was very unusual. You know, it was the first time that we'd ever done that. So I guess, are you saying that if we had language where we would evaluate the need for either a hot or cold shelter, you know, based on certain criteria, and then we wouldn't need the council to take action because it would then be upon staff to kind of automatically evaluate those conditions, or?
It depends on how you approach it. So you could say that we're always going to have to redirect staff from normal activities in order to do this, or redirect funds in order to do this, and so we need a declaration to allow that, internally tied to a regulation around extreme weather events. Or you can say, really, when it comes to this type of response, our action is just to reach out to partners that we've worked to establish and ask them to activate on the city's behalf, and then evaluate if we need additional resources beyond that. So I guess it depends on to what level are you trying to establish what your extreme weather events response is going to be at your level.
Okay. I'll have to think about that some more.
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions right now? Joel?
Well, with regards to the warming center, assuming that we get one up and operational with nonprofit, I assume that they have some guidelines that they follow when it would be open, you know, for the reasons that we did what we did a week ago or 2 weeks ago. That should be handled, I would guess, at that point in time with the nonprofit's operating procedures.
Yeah, I would think so too, although theoretically, if that shelter was at capacity and we're having very cold weather, there
Sure.
might still be additional need.
Well, if we get a big storm and the electricity goes out and nobody has any heat, then that's a different situation.
Correct, and that's where, so in one of the slides, I said it's probably useful to kind of back up a little bit and finish defining. There's a difference between temporary shelters, as you know, and a difference between permanent shelters. You're moving towards having both in your community. And there's almost two types of temporary shelters, right? Because what you did the other day was like a community pop-up temporary, but what the current rules are written as for temporary to up to 6 months, right? So there's almost kind of, you should probably identify the role of almost like that community level pop-up temporary shelter is to supplement existing temporary and permanent shelters that serve kind of almost, even though they're called temporary, it's an ongoing situation regardless
short-term
of your extreme weather events, correct? And then, you know, to Joel's point about, well, if we have a lot of folks, you know, without power, which was one of the concerns going into that December storm event, again, depending on scale and widespread impact, that could become an emergency or disaster level response. If there had been enough folks impacted and the need and resources had to be pulled in, we would have probably had county and Red Cross supported shelters and things like that. It just didn't get to that level of impact, but for a while it had that potential. So again, that's again where, you know, the definition between a disaster and a non-disaster. Because you have different resources available for each.
Valerie?
Yeah, I was going to talk about, because I do know there has been, in Medford and Ashland, they do have established criteria for the shelter, or they have in the past, it's my understanding. So I think having examples of it would be really important for us to have it. And then the second point is partners. We have to have a building that is available that, you know, whether it's a partner's building or whatever. So once again, it goes back out to that, building that community partner, whether it talk to the county about, you know, a building at the fairgrounds or what we have. And so that's, I think, where we're at, is we have to because you can't declare something if you don't have anywhere to put anybody. So that's, I think, to me, the number one place we need to start. And I would appreciate, anything that other communities have done locally, temperature that they've used to establish the set point that they are willing to reach out to the community partners saying, hey, we have this event coming up. We're going to probably need more than the 30 that we have. If UCAN has that, would you help us out there?
And I can provide, working with your staff, an example of an approach for a local city jurisdiction in which they tied their extreme weather response and activities to the need to use a declaration as a trigger, usually involving a regulation on the books or that is created for that, or one that is just circumstantial and doesn't necessitate a declaration in order to activate that response each time. So you can decide.
Any questions for Emily? Nope. They're out of questions today.
Yes, Mayor, this is Vanessa.
Go ahead, Vanessa.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation, Emily. I think that provided some very much needed clarification on this topic. Would you mind please forwarding that presentation to Aaron so that we can have a copy of it? There's a lot of really great information in there.
We just didn't have
Yep,
it.
you'll get, yes, there's nodding going on here if you can't see that.
Yeah, we didn't have it via email, so some people who aren't here today won't have their copies of it. Okay, council, any discussion on this? I don't know, we were having a conversation behind the scenes over the weekend gosh, it must have been Christmas weekend, maybe even, about doing the emergency winter weather shelter and just kind of how that would go down. I think Aaron had an understanding that the council wanted him to do something at the city level, and we knew it wasn't going to be expensive in terms of cost, something that would exceed spending authority, and yet we don't have a guide in place for, what triggers something like this and what the process is. And he and I had a little bit of a discussion. I didn't know, do I need to make some sort of declaration? Does he need to make some sort of declaration? Do we need to have the council make some sort of declaration? And that's where, because we had a little window of time there, because it was anticipated weather, we were able to schedule in that emergency meeting. I think in a lot of situations that, we do meet every Monday, right? So we wouldn't necessarily need emergency meetings. That one was going down during the holidays where we had canceled our Monday meeting. So caused that. However, I think it kind of illustrated a need for having, some sort of process in writing, because I know I was like searching the books trying to figure out what we were supposed to do, and I wasn't clear, and I wasn't clear what my role was, and I think Aaron and I probably each ended up spending several hours more than we needed to on December 26th, having conversations about that and everything. So just as we move forward, it's good that we're talking about this, because I think we do have a bit of a need to get something on paper. Thank you, Emily.
Okay. More fun later. And then while I'm here, before I forget, this is for mayor, council, as well as your executive level staff. A reminder on the emergency operations plan, if any of you had any edits to give to me, I'm collecting those by January 14th, which is coming up. Hopefully they're only minor, but I'll take whatever you want, and then I'll work on getting a final version out there that's going to stand probably for the next couple of years.
Okay.
Thank you.
Any comments, Aaron? You look like maybe you.
Well, I'm just wondering if council has any action they want coming out of this conversation or not. If you'd like, I can work with Emily and we could draft something for your consideration that would provide for some criteria, guidelines associated with declaring a severe weather event and allowing shelters to occur. It doesn't mean that, like some cities like Medford, Bend, others that have these, it's not that the city is going to be operating the severe weather shelter. It's just that it's declaring it and allowing an easier access for those nonprofits to pull together something in a location. So if you'd like, we could provide some sample language for your consideration at a future workshop, or I can provide it in a memo format, and then if you want, we can take future council action on it at a meeting.
Rick?
Aaron, I wonder if it'd be prudent to look at what Ashland or Medford has as a sample, and if you wanted to put them together or come up with your own version, but that might be a way of starting.
Yeah, I'd be certainly happy to do that if that's the direction council would like to go, to establish some kind of community guidelines for declaring a severe weather event.
Seeing Valerie nod, yes.
Yes, I am in support of that. I think that it would be nice to have that, and then, so I would appreciate that.
They're a quiet bunch today, but I think yes, Aaron, that would be good. Thank you. All right, next up, Urban Renewal Agency.
All right. Good morning, or afternoon as the case may be. So this presentation is just going to give the council an update on the Urban Renewal Agency Forum that we had on November 30th, and then talk about a few next steps. And it relates to your council goals by providing cooperative shared leadership involving council staff and the community. Just by way of background, I looked back. I thought we had discussed this a little bit more than what's shown here, but I'm showing in 2021, the council had 2 dates where the Urban Renewal Agency and particularly funding were talked about. That's September 20 and November 8th. On September 20, I brought to you a presentation that kind of focusing mainly on how the urban renewal funds could be used with private parties, particularly through grants, and we kind of proposed a framework for what that might look like. There wasn't any consensus at that September 20 workshop. There was a lot of good discussion, but there wasn't consensus. Some councilors supported using the urban renewal area funds for private sector grants broadly. Others suggested a focus on focusing our energies on public sector projects right now, or maybe capping grant amounts at, say, only 10 or 15% of the total balance that we have in the Urban Renewal Fund. Others suggested using grants for affordable housing projects and then use loans for non-housing. So I think that's kind of reflective of a lot of the conversation that has been happening behind the scenes as well. In terms of where we're at with the Urban Renewal Agency. So then on November 8th, the focus of that workshop was really giving the council just the full list of what those 18 projects are that are currently in the plan and their respective budget allocations. Again, varying opinions that were shared at that meeting. 5 councilors supported removing the convention center from the list, which in the first plan in 2016 was actually at 18 million, and then in 2020 that 10 million of that was reallocated to other projects. That left it with a balance of 7 million, which is currently at. There was some talk about the Redwood Hotel being added to the project list, some concern about doing that, general support for housing as an urban renewal focus. There were some pros and cons thrown out there about urban renewal area borrowing funds and leveraging the capital that the agency currently has through borrowing. And then there was support for quarterly discussions of the urban renewal area, urban renewal agency being brought up to the council as needed to kind of, give you regular opportunities to continue to talk about it. So that was all, those were the two formal workshops that the council had, and then we had, as you know, November 30th was the community forum. We held that here in this room, and we had mostly in person. It was made available in person and virtual. We had 8 public, 3 staff, and 4 city councilors attend. We did get 4 emails prior to that forum, and then there was 2 written public comments given at the forum. And looking at those, Susan Searider and I kind of looked at those and felt that they could pretty easily be grouped into 3 different categories: urban renewal project ideas, marketing and outreach, and then funding tools. And so the next 3 slides, I'll just kind of go over what those are. So in terms of the urban renewal project ideas, and I should point out that this list on the next 3 slides was just the November 30 forum. It doesn't reflect the August 18th meeting that we had with another group of stakeholders, including some bankers and real estate agents and other folks who have property in the urban renewal boundary. That was a summary that we gave to you in September. Definitely some overlapping ideas, though. But this list doesn't incorporate that August meeting. So there was a number of ideas, as you might imagine, kind of ranging everything from focusing on public infrastructure like the Spalding area, or like some other parts of industrial areas that need an upgrade in sewer or water or streetscape. There was some ideas about, capitalizing on that Terry Lane 5 acres that was added to the urban renewal boundary last year. Paring it back and prioritizing the project list was one comment, saying that it's 18 is kind of too much. We should focus it down. Expanding the industrial zones, partnering with the private industry, Spalding Industrial Park was mentioned a couple of different times. Discussion about public open space investments and using urban renewal funds to either build a plaza, public plaza, or focus on the Caveman pool. The downtown historic district and the town center plaza were mentioned by a couple of participants. Streetscapes, focusing on the blighted areas and neighborhoods which are inside the urban renewal boundary. And then another comment about using it for an incubator. This is one of the projects already, using kind of the innovation hub idea. So the next category that a lot of these comments fell into, we thought, was marketing and outreach. And the first one there, I think, really, if you're going to pick one theme that emerged that seemed to get a lot of energy, if you will, was increasing the public engagement with those property owners and potential developers in the urban renewal area. There was, a sense that, this is great, we're glad we're having this conversation, but, can you send out letters? Can you send out other information that talks about how property owners who own land can become more involved with accessing the funds? So that's kind of the summary of those first 2 on the left. And then also just encouraging new partnerships versus new taxes, doing more to promote the city's accessory dwelling unit program and encourage those as rentals, using the website, being flexible, being ready to engage with private investors. And this relates to other comments from the first stakeholder meeting that we had about, really making sure that the city is prepared when developers come to the city to rapidly respond to the needs that they have and the requests that they have. And then there was one comment about having a dedicated urban renewal staff to work with the private industry who can kind of act independently with them. And then the third category, funding tools, there was several comments about, well, how, what are the specific mechanisms that the Urban Renewal Agency could use? A low interest revolving loan fund was thrown out, establishing a housing and development trust fund. That's similar to what we have already done and put in place, related to affordable housing, SDC grants, but maybe building on that. Incentivizing blighted building rehabilitation, using grants or rebates, interest loans, low interest loans. Also looking at issuing bonds for Caveman Pool. That was a specific project linked with a specific funding idea. Using small grants and then using job creation as a criteria for grants. One member mentioned that. So all of that being said, it raises the question, what now, and where do we go with next steps of implementation? And staff thinks there's a couple of outstanding policy questions in order to take us to the next level. One of those we talked about in September is the utilization of grants. So as I mentioned, we did put forward kind of a framework for how we could do this now, and that's just using the application forms that we already have for economic development grants and distributing those, to urban renewal owners and making sure that they're aware that, that's an opportunity. We already have in a couple of projects, that 25% is already adopted in the plan, meaning if a developer comes in with a project, the Urban Renewal Agency, if it's infrastructure related, would contribute up to 25% of that total cost as kind of an incentive. And that could be done, as I mentioned now, kind of using the framework that we have for grants, just having them be specific to that infrastructure project. Second, there is the level of council involvement with the grant and loan approvals. You gave us the go-ahead for kind of using a two-tier system, I should say, before in September, where if someone comes in at under $25,000 amount, and it matches up with the existing plan, that those can be proceeded with as long as the council is informed of what those are. What hasn't gotten really much more discussion is whether the council wants to see an Urban Renewal Agency subcommittee that would, maybe meet and be more involved with the the review of certain grants or loans. Third, there new project funding allocations using the $7 million. As I mentioned, there was 5 councilors that supported reallocating that convention center money. That would obviously involve a lot of conversation amongst yourselves about where does that, if in fact you're going to do that, and since you have consensus, where would that $7 million go and where would it be allocated? And then fourth is the pros and cons of having a dedicated urban renewal area staff person. And on this next slide, we talk a little bit about that on the last bullet. This was just kind of more for information for the council about, these are some urban renewal agency topics that are coming up just over the next couple of months. Your strategic planning session, of course, always has a segment of the strategic planning dedicated to the Urban Renewal Agency. So you'll have some time there to discuss. And then January 24th, there's a presentation on the Caveman Pool funding. Kind of at large, not just the Urban Renewal Agency role, but that would certainly be a part of that discussion. Adam's doing some other background work on some other funding tools for the Caveman Pool, but the Urban Renewal Agency piece would be a part of that discussion. And then on January 31st, Caveman Plaza Task Force. I've been in conversations with Elaine Howard, our urban renewal consultant, about that meeting, and so she's going to be here virtually, and we'll be able to kind of give you some of her ideas and thoughts about how to more focus that Caveman Pool Task Force scope based on her experience with other cities. So we'll have that, and then the February, this relates to the prior slide, but we're putting together a staff memo now that would talk about a potential position that would be funded in part through the Urban Renewal Agency. And the real focus of that, that would not involve any new general fund money, but using some of the money that's funding the business advocate position. There's just a lot here, as you can see through this presentation, and in order for us to really move to the next step and be effective and give you the best information and do more effective outreach, we just are putting the pros and cons of having that person that can help us take it to the next level. So that's what we have for staff. At this point, council is at your discretion. There are a couple of alternatives. We could proceed with allowing those urban renewal area grants for private sector projects. I think we more or less have that framework in place. We haven't really proceeded because that clear direction, really hasn't been there from that September meeting. But that could be part of your discussion today, suspending any grant activity until after strategic planning and more workshops, and then setting a date for a workshop to continue the prioritization conversation, and particularly how does that $7 million for the convention center get kind of reallocated.
Thank you, Brad. Council, do you have any questions? Valerie?
I do have a couple. Obviously, the February is the Susan C. Ryder with her retirement, correct? In terms of reestablishing the role that she has and maybe using that, am I correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, January 21 actually is her final day.
Is her final day,
Yep.
yeah, I know, but so I'm saying, are we going to have that discussion before February, or because it just has February in terms of, will the discussion happen before that? Will it happen at the strategic planning, or I'm just trying to think of when.
Well, that's up to you, I think.
No, we're putting a proposal together, and I'll be providing a memo, and then potentially a workshop presentation on the reorganizing the economic development, urban renewal type of projects that we have. So when that's prepared, we'll be able to bring that forward to you.
Okay, thank you, Erin. Okay, that's my first one. I'll let somebody else go if they have one.
Any other questions? Joel?
So do we have any present grant activity that, occurring between now and strategic planning, which is going to happen fairly soon?
We do not have any applications that are in community development at this point. There have been some conversations about, how can we utilize urban renewal funding to support a project, but we've partly because they haven't been ready, but also because we have said that as a city we're still, sort of formalizing the grant program and going in council. So, but we don't have any formal applications.
So since we don't have any, hardly those first two dots are almost irrelevant because it's going to happen, any grant activity is not probably going to happen after the strategic planning anyway. Is that what I heard you say?
Yes, in terms of processing, paperwork for that, I think it would just be whether you wanted us to be more proactive about advertising.
Between now and strategic planning?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, strategic planning is next week, so I don't think much of anything's going to be happening now except for the planning of the strategic planning, right?
Yeah.
All right, any questions, folks? No.
I just
Valerie, go ahead.
This actually goes to our agenda setting. So I noticed that at the next public meeting in February, that Ward Warren is coming back with design grants. Is that just rewarding what he's already gotten, or? Am I correct?
It is. That particular grant only has a 6-month approval period on it as compared to a year, which some of the other grants have. And so this is a request from Mr. Warren to extend that beyond the 6 months. The project is done in terms of installing the sprinkler system, but the 6-month time frame just has kind of prevented us from reimbursing him because of the expiration.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, sounds like we don't have any questions about URA grants at the moment. But we do need to get to a point on this project of making some decisions about whether or not we're going to establish that grant program and what the criteria will be so that staff can move forward if we're going to designate a portion of those funds for private grants. How about Allen Creek rezone scenario?
Okay. Amber Neek, our housing and neighborhood specialist, was intended to join me, but is unavailable today, so I'm going to try to work my way through this. This is a follow-up really to some direction that the council gave us a couple of months ago about our urban growth boundary rezone project and the direction to just focus in on the Allen Creek area. And this relates to your council goals to facilitate sustainable and manageable growth by increasing the supply of urban zone land for new development. I also wanted to throw on there the comprehensive plan goal number 9, which ties into all of this, and that's when applying new residential zones, we need to ensure adequate development capacity. That's a specific goal in the city's adopted plans, and this helps us get to that. So this is a map that we've presented a few times now. The southern area, Southwest C, is the Allen Creek. So the direction we have is basically limit going down from 5 areas down to the 1, potentially the north, if we can get the traffic impact analysis to work on that. So the October 4th meeting, you gave us direction to scope this down, as I mentioned, and then council also asked for input from the Housing Advisory Committee on rezoning scenarios beyond that base R2 zone. And they did meet on November 19th, and then the Planning Commission met on December 8th as well, talk about the same subject. These next 2 points I won't really go into. It's just kind of talking about characteristics of the affected area, which I think the council is mostly aware of. We presented this to the Housing Committee and the Urban Area Planning Commission as some background, but essentially saying that, that Allen Creek Road is currently a rural section. It's all mostly zoned R5 in Josephine County. On these what factors do we use to guide rezoning? This is just information that's taken largely from the development code as well as from the housing needs analysis and some state statute. What are we looking for? The main one I wanted to point out is on a couple of these sub-bullets, achieving residential land use efficiency by selecting higher density zones. That got a lot of discussion because what the council asked for input on is, well, rather than just R2, what would happen if we went to R3 and R4? Clearly, there's a potential for additional increased development. We generally in planning, you don't want to see too much over over assignment of densities and to allow for some of that flexibility. And so you'll see one of the maps tries to do that. And the second one there is limiting lower density zones to sites that have development constraints. And in this case, the development constraint is really steep slope as you move along to the eastern portion of this area. This is some of the same information. You have also were presented a few months ago with this slide, which is saying that the population growth will require 4,055 new units as well as 227 group quarter dwellings. Now that's in the entire city limits over the next 20 years. So paring that down, what does that look like? That's a projection that came through the housing needs analysis, which is this center column. What that analysis didn't do was factor in our current deficit. It just looked at starting from today, looking out to 2040, what do we need? So we conservatively looked at, well, what would be considered a deficit if you look at some of the past housing needs analysis saying where we should be in 2021 or 2022. And we looked at basically 1,000 unit deficit and then calculated that out using the percentages that you see here. And that brought us to these numbers in the right column. So if you look at the 20-year need plus the deficit, that actually gets us to, over 5,000 units. So again, we're just talking citywide there. For this project, when we're looking at going from an R2 to an R3 or an R4, how much acreage do we need to focus on for just, say, the townhomes, the fourplexes, and the multifamily? And these are estimates to achieve that. So, for example, the townhome plexes projection of 934 units, that's from this prior slide right here, which is saying that's our deficit plus the need. So 934 units, if you look at the R3, that would take between 53 and 75 acres of land to get that number of units. Similarly, for the R4, because it allows for a higher density, you would need less land. So similar for the multifamily, to get to 687 units, needing between 39 and 55 acres in the R3 and 19 and 34 acres in the R4. And that gives us that total need across all the city limits. So for this project, we're talking about just over 61 acres. That's the number of acres that's in that Allen Creek area. There's 35 parcels, 2 of which are vacant. And so if you take just the R2 zoning, that would net you out at about 530 units total for that Allen Creek area. And then it just corresponds. As you go up to the R3, you get about 740 net units, and then R4, you would get 1,492 units. And that net is basically looking at the gross area, minusing out wetlands and future right-of-way and steep slopes. So the next 3 slides are basically the scenarios that that we're bringing forward to the council that we would like to see, and that the Housing Advisory Committee and Urban Planning Commission have said they would support to take for a traffic impact analysis. So in order to project the traffic out, we need to give the traffic engineers some base numbers to work with. And this would be the low end scenario. This map is showing the R4 land that we already have. This is the intersection of Harbeck and Allen Creek at the top. And you can see this lighter yellow is the higher density R4, and then the orange color is the R2. So that gives you to a max density of about 1,600 units. And that is what the the current proposal going back to 2020 has in it. The next one would basically do the other bookend. Instead of the low, we would put forward a high, and that would be rezoning it all to R4, and that would be not recommended, but it would give the traffic engineers, you know, a bookend to work with to say, okay, well, if this was all R4, what kind of levels of traffic are we talking about? And that, as you can see, is way up there, 3,200 units for just that 61 acres. A more likely build-out scenario might look like this, and that's showing the combination, you know, a mix of different zones, mix of different densities in this area, showing R2 at about 21 acres, R3 at 23.7 acres, etc., for a max density in that whole area of 2,050. And so what we're basically talking about is a scenario that we would come back to the council and the commission with that says, okay, here's the specific rezoning scenario. The reason, as you may recall, that we're doing all this is because we got a letter from the Oregon Department of Transportation that said, you know, you're going to have to do a much more detailed study as to what transportation improvements are needed for your upzone. If we do anything upzoning from an R3 or higher, that is going to trigger a comprehensive plan amendment. That's what this slide is saying. The current comp plan designation going back to 2014 has moderate density on this whole area. I'm sorry, not the whole area, just the majority of it, but right at Harbeck and Allen Creek, it's higher. So to proceed with anything that has the R3 or up, we would have to also do a comprehensive plan amendment. Not impossible, it just adds another level of review. We do have adopted plans, wastewater, water, stormwater for this area. We talked with Public Works saying if we went with one of these scenarios, is it out of the picture? Are we going to be pushing or extending this too much? Wade was pretty comfortable with proceeding at least now with the study where it is, and then once we get the numbers back, we'll take another harder look at it. So where we're at here is the commissions and the committees have these three different scenarios: the baseline, the maximum upzone, and then kind of that strategic mix. And David Evans and Associates, our traffic engineer, they would at this point run three different scenarios through their traffic impact, come back to us in about a month, showing what those numbers would be for both the kind of New Hope intersection, because some traffic would be anticipated to go to New Hope. Most of the traffic probably would go back north and head towards Highway 199. They would look at those intersections and come back and say, here's what would be involved. And I think, unless the council wants to take this a different direction, we're at a point where we just kind of need your okay to take these, or if you would like us to, present some other scenarios, but these are the three where we're at. We already have a contract with David Evans and Associates that has enough balance in there that they can run this particular traffic impact analysis without any new funding required. We would be under that $36,000, $36,500 contract. So I think that's all I have for you.
I have a question, Brad, about the three different scenarios. So the purpose of that is not that we're making any decision, but just to provide three different scenarios that we would then use to gauge how the traffic would be impacted, and then we would come back and make a decision on how we wanted to rezone?
Correct.
Is that kind of where we're at for now? Okay, thanks. Yeah, and you do a really good job of trying to explain things simply, but sometimes I just need the dummy version, you know?
You bet.
Rick and then Val.
Thank you, Brad. So is there, when you say it may require a change in the comprehensive plan from the R2, is that any deviation from the current plan, or is there some minor modification that would still stay under that threshold?
So the first scenario would not require a comp plan amendment. This first one that I showed that has the R4 at the north end and then R2 for the balance going down to Denton Trail, that matches the current comp plan, but either one of the next two would require a comp plan amendment.
Okay, thank you.
Valerie?
Yes, part of that, obviously, is city-owned property, and if I'm not mistaken, the ones down at the, I don't know what direction that is, but whatever, down on my map, which is usually south, but it's probably not on this map.
It is.
Oh, is it? Oh, lucky day. Is right up against Allen Creek Playground in that area. Am I correct? So when you're looking at these scenarios, are those including those areas in as being developed to that density as well? Or does that consider them as being a future park and therefore not being housing?
Yeah, great question. And I didn't talk about that, but yeah, all of these cross-hatched parcels are city-owned. The numbers that are here on the left and to get to the max density do actually assume build out. So, you know, that's, if we hold on to those city properties for parkland or any other purpose, working with Allendale School, you know, which is just right across the creek there. Any of those, obviously, you're talking about less numbers, less density. If we do retain, you know, to date, there hasn't been any discussion about building those out as parkland, but they, you know, they're there and could be that. So we could certainly ask the engineer to, you know, take some of that out to give us a little more accurate number, or run both. You know, but that's the nice thing. We're at the stage that we're in now. We just want as many scenarios and as good a data as we can in order to decide what's the best rezoning to go with.
And my second question to that is, you talked about the comp plan amendment and making that, how much time would going through a comp plan amendment or changing that, how much time are we talking?
So the comp plan amendment can actually run concurrent with the rezone. So time-wise, it doesn't make any difference because you can do both together concurrently through the approval process. It takes additional staff time to work on that.
Okay, all right, thank you.
Rick?
So with that comp time and zone change, you could look 6 to 9 months out. Would that be realistic or hopeful, or what's your calendar?
Well, I think once we have the go-ahead to proceed with a particular specific rezone, you know, it's more like around that 4 to 5 months. That would be on the outside because it does require a public hearing of the Planning Commission and a public hearing at the City Council.
Go ahead, Rick.
So when we look at these maps here, and when it comes back to us in the future, would we also want to look at potential changes in the urban growth boundary and see what other areas might be expanding? Because we may not want to pour all the density here, but spread it around the city. Would that be a potential thing that we should be looking at when we look at this? Not today, but just in the future.
Well, in this particular area, the urban growth boundary runs, you know, along the west side and then comes in here where the white, essentially the white is Josephine County outside the urban growth boundary, and the color is inside the urban growth boundary. You probably can't see that dash blue, but that's the urban growth boundary line there. To say, can we look at urban growth boundary expansion? I mean, you certainly can, but I don't know that there's much in this particular area. Josephine County has recently approved a planned unit development on this parcel right here. These are kind of built out. We have a water reservoir that's on one of these. So, I mean, it's a much more complicated process.
I think it's more of a separate issue because you'd want to take a look at our whole urban growth boundary, not just one area, if you're going to go through the process of maybe acquiring additional land in there. So it'd be a much more in-depth study of our entire area.
How critical would it be if we were to decide whether or not to hold that city-owned property aside as park versus residential? How important is that to do that before this process?
I don't think it's that critical because we can ask the engineer to subtract out those particular parcels in one of their analysis. I mean, it's essentially going to reduce the number of trips. I mean, depending on what kind of use there is there, but
So factoring it in as residential would result in more traffic.
Typically, yeah, depending on the type of park. I mean, if you do a big regional park like Reinhardt or something, you're going to generate, or what, if you have large ball fields that have tournaments, I mean, then you get into more comparable. But for high density residential, typically it's going to be more.
So that would not be that critical of a thing to do. We just would be great to get additional clarity from council of, we want to make sure that that's in there as a potential residential inventory, and we'll look at that. They're already doing so many other data gathering that won't be a big deal. The bigger deal with that, related to that question, Mayor, is then we would need to take a look at our Parks Master Plan, as that area of the city is lacking in parks. And so if we were to take that out of the inventory, there would need to be a pretty good study on what alternative park areas we'd be looking at in that area.
Right. It sounds to me like for the purpose of this plan, leaving it in as residential would kind of allow us to plan for, worst case scenario, so to speak, as far as traffic goes. Maximum use scenarios may be better word than worst, but, and then if we were to hold some of it aside as parkland, we just have maybe a little bit more road than needed or something like that. Joel, go ahead.
Well, as part of the Caveman pool study, the committee recommended in the future, doesn't mean that it's going to happen, but and it's going to put it into the master plan for the council, an Aquatic Center in Allen Creek, which would probably be I think this scenario would cover it as well, and whether we do that or not, that's up in the air. But that was the thinking of the parks, the pool committee. So I would guess that would be a fairly significant impact.
Yeah.
Rick?
Brad, when those traffic scenarios come back, will they include, I'm looking for confirmation, will they include the improvements that would be required to go to those densities? So in other words,
yes.
Okay, so if we need more traffic lights, or if we have to, I don't want to say this, but Allen Creek Road now needs to be a 4-lane highway instead of a 2-lane.
Right. Yeah, the Oregon Transportation Planning Rule, under the Oregon Administrative Rules, 660 specifically requires that. So if you upzone property, you don't just give a traffic number, you also give the required infrastructure and a dollar figure associated with that.
Do you see that playing as a major factor when we choose how much density we want at that location?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it'll be a big important part of the consideration.
Okay, thank you.
Val?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that, that will have a huge impact, because that's exactly why we're doing this, is that's why they didn't let us take in all of the 540 acres, is because they recognize that depending upon how you build it up, the infrastructure, you need to know what it's going to cost to truly develop that area up, as opposed to the whole part. So they're saying, you've got to have exactly what it's going to cost you, so you know going into it what you're going to need to have. And that came straight from ODOT. I mean, that's their requirement. I want you to go back just for a couple minutes to the 5 sub areas, the map that has the 5 sub areas, because I just want some clarification on those colors. So there's the orange, there's the yellow, there's the pink, there's the blue. So I'm assuming that the orange is what is considered residential and housing. The blue is like business park. Am I correct?
Yes, yes.
The yellow commercial, are those?
Low density.
Low density, okay. So those are the things, so basically when we look at the number of units that we need down the road, what we're really looking at is those areas, the primary areas, those would be built out, would be those orange areas. So, okay, I just wanted clarification of that. And the orange down in the southeast, that's to the south of, what is that? Oh,
It's like Clover Lawn and
okay. Okay.
kind of that area.
Okay. Okay, and the west is up housing-wise on the other side of, down by the river, is that correct?
Right, Leonard Lane, Willow Lane, that's kind of there. So we have, there's quite a bit of that orange color, which is the medium density.
Okay.
That R2, R18.
Okay.
And then, the yellow would be more like your R112 and your R110. That's your like 11,000 square foot lot sizes compared to like 5,000.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that.
You bet.
Any other questions?
Thanks.
Thank you, Brad. All right, any discussion on this for the moment? Go ahead, Val.
Yeah, we need to go forward with this. As we have talked with the building community, the largest factor at this point that they feel is holding them back from being able to meet it is a lack of land. And that lack of land is coming about as a result of having that urban growth boundary and not being able to move forward in development because we don't have the traffic information studies that we need. So I think, especially since it's within the budget of what we have, and we have a consultant right now, I think it's very important that we move forward to get this information soon, because Allen Creek is on, the radar for to be built. So I think the sooner we can get this, the better.
Aaron.
Yeah, I just want to, I think you guys are being I think council's being very modest with this discussion, and I just want to make sure I give you credit for what you're doing. This truly is a huge incentive for the builders in this community. What you're doing is you are fronting an expense that they would have to do, an expense in monetary resources to hire a traffic engineer, plus the expense of timing, and you're trying to find certain areas that are underdeveloped that have development potential. You are utilizing resources, being the city, to front load that and get the traffic impact studies done, to get the plan ready to go, to help incentivize that development. So kudos to you, council, for this is an extremely unique way to help incentivize development, but this is a piece that I think developers would find very helpful. And I just wanted to make sure to give you guys credit for that, because you haven't talked about it, but it should be known that you guys are doing a great job with that out of the box incentivizing.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, Valerie suggested that we should move forward on this. Does that have everybody's support? DJ and Vanessa chime in.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I do support moving forward on this and having David Evans and Associates bring us back information on that. I think the timing of the minimum density discussion also going to UAPC shortly and coming back to us. I think that these two projects will align nicely to ensure that those properties are built to their capacity. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, I got a couple thumbs up from people in the room here, and nobody's objecting. DJ says rock and roll, so I think we are good to move forward on that. All right. Brings us to agenda review, and next week our normally scheduled workshop and city council meeting are canceled because we have strategic planning coming up Thursday, Friday, Saturday at police headquarters. So get some rest and exercise over the weekend because you're going to be sitting in a chair for a few days next week. But it's fun. It's a good opportunity for us all to refocus on what our priority should be for the coming year. That said, our next regular meeting will be January 24th's workshop, where we have coming up a discussion on the chamber property request. That is the discussion about whether or not to sell or give the property that we own where the chamber building is located at the north end of town. Discussion on pool funding options for Caveman Pool. Discussion on the Allenwood property. And then okay, just a motion to acknowledge the Urban Renewal Agency report that must have a deadline associated with it. There we go. All right, and then we'll have one more meeting this week, this month. Woo. Already so ready for 2022 to be over. January 31st with some committee interviews and an update from the DMO, and we'll hear about their business plan and talk about the Caveman Plaza task force. Anything? I know we're going to have a lot of chats at strategic planning that will kind of maybe reset some of our goals further out, so I don't want us to get too far ahead of ourselves, but if you have anything burning that we need to get on here, or Valerie, go ahead.
I just have a question. Are we going to be talking about the ARPA funds during the strategic planning?
No, that is one item that I have on my notes to talk with the mayor and council president about for our meeting that we're going to have later on this week, and to put that on the agenda for future discussion.
Okay, ARPA funds. I'm going to get that urban campground discussion with the All Care Community Foundation. We need to make a decision about how we're going to proceed on that. Valerie.
Yeah, I have talked with several people about the fact that I have talked to a couple of financiers or bankers who would be willing to come to the council and have a discussion on funding for, more high density and affordable housing, and how funding is appropriated through the banking industry. I think that's a really important piece of all of our affordable housing discussions, to explain how banks look at things and what their perspective is on funding projects as we move forward. So I would like to see that also on one of our workshops.
So that's just some kind of FYI sort of background for the council on how those low-income housing projects come together. All right. All right. Well, I know we will have plenty to talk about next week, and then we will be resetting our focus for the year. Anybody interested in adjourning today? Why not? Valerie?
I'll make a motion to adjourn.
All right, second from Rick. Thank you. All in favor of adjourning? Any opposed?
Aye.
Thanks, Vanessa. All right, we are adjourned. See you next Thursday.
At what time? I'm